Soft light from crystal chandeliers spilled across polished marble, turning the dining room of Salve into a stage for Chicago's most untouchable power players. Money murmured at every table. Danger sat comfortably among linen napkins and fine china. No one ever noticed the waitress, until the tea reached the wrong hands. Talia Johnson moved through the dining room like part of the furniture, quiet, precise, unseen. At 22, she knew invisibility was the only way to survive among powerful men, who never looked twice at a waitress. She served the same table every night. A Korean man in a black suit ruled the room without speaking. Beside him sat his mother, elegant, commanding, untouchable. Talia noticed things others missed. When she poured the tea, something was wrong. A bitter scent cut through the steam. Her pulse spiked. As the cup rose toward the woman's lips, Talia broke protocol. She reached forward. Before the story begins, take a second to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. The silence that followed the crash of porcelain was more deafening than the shatter itself. Talia stood frozen, her fingers still tingling from the force she'd used to wrench the delicate teacup from Jang Soo's hand. Around them, the restaurant's ambient hum died instantly. The air grew heavy, charged with the sudden metallic tang of drawn weapons. Two of Kong Min's men were on their feet before the tea had even soaked into the white linen tablecloth. They didn't look like waiters or diners anymore. They looked like predators. But it was the man at the head of the table who commanded the terror in the room. Kong Min didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his tattooed hands resting flat on the table, his dark eyes fixed on Talia with a cold, predatory curiosity. "Explain," he said. The word wasn't a request. It was a death sentence held in suspension. "The steam," Talia whispered, her voice cracking before she forced it to steady. She didn't look at the guns. She looked at the spilled liquid, where a faint, sickly sweet scent of bitter almonds was beginning to rise, invisible to everyone but her. "The aroma is wrong. It isn't just jasmine. There's a high concentration of cyanide compounds, likely a synthetic derivative designed to mask the bitterness." Jang Soo, the matriarch who had been seconds away from death, raised a single elegant finger. The guards didn't holster their weapons, but they retreated a half-step. She looked at Talia, not with anger, but with the piercing gaze of a woman who had survived decades in a den of lions. "You are a waitress," Kong Min said, rising slowly. He was taller than he looked while seated, a tower of tailored wool and lethal intent. He stepped toward her, invading her space until she could smell the charcoal and spice of his cologne. He tilted her chin up with one cold finger, forcing her to meet a gaze that had broken men twice her size. "Since when do my servers specialize in chemical warfare?" "I'm a student," Talia countered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "And I know that if your mother had finished that cup, her respiratory system would have failed within 3 minutes. I didn't interfere to be disrespectful. I interfered because I don't like seeing people murdered while I'm on shift." A ghost of a smirk touched Kong Min's lips, though his eyes remained frozen. He looked down at the ruined table, then back at the girl he had ignored for months. The piece of decor had just spoken, and she had the scent of a traitor on her tongue. "If you are lying," he murmured, leaning closer until his breath brushed her ear, "I will make sure you regret finding your voice. But if you are right, then you and I have a great deal to discuss." The private office at the back of the restaurant was a sanctuary of dark mahogany and bulletproof glass, a far cry from the glittering chaos of the dining room. Kong Min sat behind a desk that looked like a monolith, his silhouette framed by the amber glow of a single desk lamp. On a silver tray between them sat the remains of the tea, a small sample Talia had insisted on recovering, and a few basic reagents she had scavenged from the kitchen's cleaning supply and the bar's bitters kit. "You have 5 minutes to prove this isn't a play for attention," Kong Min said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration. He leaned back, his tattooed hand steepled beneath his chin. "My chemists are 20 minutes away. If they find you're wasting my time, the exit from this room won't be through the door." Talia didn't let her hands shake. She focused on the chemistry, the one language that never lied to her. She used a glass stirrer to mix a drop of the tea with a concentrated solution of ferrous sulfate she'd improvised. Cyanide doesn't just kill. It suffocates the cells by inhibiting cytochrome C oxidase, she explained, her voice gaining a clinical edge that sliced through the tension. It prevents the body from using oxygen. Most people think it always smells like almonds, but that's a genetic trait. Only about 40% of the population can even detect it. I happen to be one of them. She added a drop of acid to the mixture. Slowly, the clear liquid began to shift, a murky green bleeding into a deep, startling Prussian blue. The color was vivid, an undeniable bruise in the glass. The blue doesn't lie, Talia said, looking up to meet his icy stare. That's the pigment formed when iron reacts with cyanide ions. This wasn't a mistake or a bad batch of leaves. This is a high-grade synthetic concentration. Someone didn't just want her dead. They wanted it to look like a sudden, untraceable heart attack. Kong Min stood, the movement so fluid it was predatory. He walked around the desk, his presence looming over her until she was forced to tilt her head back. He looked at the blue liquid, then at the girl who had decoded a murder in a serving vest. For the first time, the skepticism in his eyes flickered, replaced by something sharper and far more unsettling: recognition. A waitress who sees what my security misses, he murmured, his gaze tracing the lines of her face as if seeing her for the first time. A student who handles poison like a poet handles words. Tell me, Talia Johnson, what does a girl like you want with a world like mine? I don't want anything with your world, she replied, her pulse thrumming in her throat. I just want to finish my degree. The moment you spilled that tea, Kong Min said, reaching out to brush a stray coil of hair from her forehead, his touch surprisingly warm against her skin, your degree became the least of your concerns. You've identified the weapon. Now you're going to help me find the hand that held it. The kitchen of the restaurant, usually a frantic theater of clattering pans and shouted orders, was now a tomb. Kong Min's men stood at every exit, their faces stony under the harsh fluorescent lights. The staff had been lined up against the subway tiled wall, trembling in their whites. Talia stood beside Kong Min, feeling the heat of his presence at her shoulder. A dark sun that offered both protection and the threat of total consumption. The tea, Talia began, her voice echoing in the sterile space. It isn't just about what was in the cup. It's about the delivery. She walked toward the prep station where the specialty teas were kept. Her eyes scanned the canisters of loose-leaf jasmine and oolong, but she didn't stop there. She moved toward the row of small, cast-iron teapots used exclusively for the matriarch's table. The concentration I saw in the office was too high for a simple powder mix, she explained, her fingers hovering over a silver infuser. If the poison had been in the water or the leaves, the entire pot would have been lethal from the first pour. But Jiangsu always drinks 2 cups. She poured the first one herself and was fine. I watched her. It was the second cup, the one poured after the pot sat for 10 minutes, that carried the scent. Kong Min followed her, his eyes narrowed. Meaning the poison wasn't in the tea, Talia said, picking up the lid of the teapot. She turned it over, pointing to the small porous rim where the steam condensed. It was coated inside the lid in a heat-sensitive wax. As the tea steeped, the steam melted the coating, releasing the toxin into the water slowly. It's a time delay. It requires precision, access, and intimate knowledge of your mother's habits. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. This wasn't a random act of violence or a kitchen mistake. It was a calculated execution. Kong Min's gaze shifted from the teapot to the line of staff, but his eyes didn't linger on the cooks. They moved to the man standing just behind him, his lead strategist, a man who had been with the family for a decade. Talia noticed the man's hand twitch, a microscopic tremor that only someone trained in observation would catch. Only 3 people have touched that tray tonight, Kong Min said, his voice dropping to a terrifying silky whisper. He didn't look at the strategist yet, but the air in the room seemed to thin, the oxygen sucked out by his mounting rage. The realization hit Talia like a physical blow. The shadow wasn't a disgruntled chef or a rival's spy. The poisoner was standing within the circle of trust, someone who knew exactly when Jiangsu would take her second sip. She had uncovered a betrayal that went deeper than a single cup of tea. She had exposed a fracture in the very foundation of Kongmin's empire. The tension of the kitchen felt a world away as Talia was led into the private residence above the restaurant. Here the air was scented with sandalwood and expensive silk, a quiet sanctuary that defied the violence brewing downstairs. Jiangsu sat in an armchair that looked like a throne, her silver hair shimmering under the soft light. She had swapped her formal evening coat for a robe of deep plum, but her commanding presence remained undiluted. "Sit, child," Jiangsu said, her voice like velvet stretched over steel. Talia sat, her spine rigid. She felt the weight of Kongmin's gaze from the doorway. He stood like a sentinel, his presence a silent shadow that refused to leave her periphery. "My son tells me you have a mind for the invisible," the matriarch continued, her sharp eyes scanning Talia with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. "That you saw a death sentence in a wisp of steam. Most people in this city look at us and see only power or fear. They do not look closely enough to see the cracks. I've spent my life looking at what others ignore," Talia replied, her voice steadying as she met the older woman's eyes. "In chemistry, the most volatile elements are often the ones that look the most stable. You have to watch the reactions, not just the surface." Jiangsu tilted her head, a small knowing smile playing on her lips. "Observation is a lonely craft. It is the burden of those who are smarter than the room they occupy. I was once a girl like you, regarded as a porcelain doll, expected to be silent while the men bartered over blood. They didn't realize that while I was pouring tea, I was measuring the weight of their secrets." She reached out, her hand surprisingly firm as she took Talia's fingers. The matriarch didn't see a waitress. She saw a reflection. "Kongmin is a storm. He will want to use you as a shield or a weapon, but I see a kindred spirit. You didn't save me out of loyalty to a flag or a family. You saved me because you value the truth of things." Jiangsu looked toward her son, her expression becoming unmistakably powerful. "She is no longer a server in this house, Min. She is a guest. And she is the key to cleaning our home of this rot." Talia felt a shift in the room's gravity. The invisible life she had cultivated was dissolving, replaced by a dangerous, glittering spotlight. She wasn't just a student anymore. She had been claimed by the crown. The basement of Kongmin's estate held a sterile, high-tech laboratory that seemed at odds with the mansion's classical architecture. It was a cold room of glass and stainless steel, designed for the clinical analysis of the organization's products. Now it belonged to Talia. She had traded her serving vest for a white lab coat, the weight of the fabric grounding her as she stood before a gas chromatography mass spectrometry (GCMS) unit. Kongmin watched her from the shadows of the doorway, his presence a constant low-frequency hum. He remained silent, a predator waiting for the kill, as Talia worked with the focused grace of someone who had spent thousands of hours over a Bunsen burner. She had processed the residue from the teapot lid, isolating the toxin from the wax that had hidden it. "The cyanide was just the delivery vehicle," Talia said, her eyes fixed on the monitor as a series of sharp, jagged peaks began to climb across the screen. "It's what was tagged to the molecules that matters. Look at these spectral lines." She pointed to a specific cluster on the readout. "This isn't a mass-produced chemical. The carbon isotopes have a very specific signature, a synthetic footprint left by the catalyst used during its synthesis. It's like a serial number for a poison." Kongmin stepped closer, his shadow falling over the glowing screen. "Can you trace the source?" "I can do better," Talia replied, her heartbeat steadying as the data began to tell its story. "This specific reaction requires a temperature-controlled laboratory and a very rare precursor chemical, cobalt-based. There are only 2 suppliers in the tri-state area that distribute this compound to private labs. And this particular batch has been modified to remain stable, at the exact temperature of your mother's preferred tea." She turned to face him, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her eyes. "This wasn't just bought. It was commissioned. The person who made this had to know the precise degree of the water in her porcelain pot. They didn't just want her dead. They wanted to prove they knew her better than anyone else did. The air in the lab grew frigid. Kong Min's jaw tightened, the ink on his hands appearing darker against his pale skin. Talia realized that her science had just narrowed the list of suspects to a handful of people who lived within the inner sanctum. The traitor wasn't just an associate. They were a ghost in the family's most private moments. The laboratory of secrets, Kong Min whispered, his gaze moving from the data to Talia's face. You've given me the name of the weapons maker. Now we find out who paid the bill. The interrogation room was a concrete box deep beneath the estate, smelling of damp earth and cold iron. In the center sat Jin Ho, a man Talia recognized from the restaurant, the lead strategist who had served as Kong Min's right hand for nearly a decade. He sat with his hands folded, his expression a mask of practiced calm, though the slight sheen of sweat on his forehead betrayed the cooling system's failure to mask his fear. Kong Min stood in the shadows behind Talia, a silent mountain of a man. He didn't speak. He had decided that Talia's intellect was a sharper blade than his own intimidation. The cobalt catalyst, Talia began, her voice echoing softly against the concrete. She laid a printed copy of the mass spectrometry graph on the table. It's a unique chemical fingerprint, Jin Ho. It traces back to a boutique lab in the north suburbs. A lab that received a cash payment 3 weeks ago from a shell company registered to a dry cleaning business on 22nd Street. Jin Ho didn't flinch. I handle many accounts, Miss Johnson. A dry cleaner is hardly a smoking gun. It isn't about the business, Talia countered, leaning forward until she was within his personal space, mirroring the way Kong Min had once hovered over her. It's about the thermal stability. The wax I found on the teapot lid was designed to melt at exactly 82 degrees Celsius. That's the precise temperature Jiang Su insists her jasmine tea be served at. Not a degree higher, not a degree lower. She watched his eyes. There, a microscopic flicker of the pulse in his neck. Only someone who spent years observing the family's private rituals would know that, she continued. But you made one mistake. You're a strategist, not a chemist. You assumed the synthetic scent would vanish completely once the tea cooled. You didn't realize that the cobalt leaves a metallic residue that binds to the porcelain. When I ran the swab, I didn't just find the poison. I found the traces of the specific cologne you wore the day you prepared the test batch. The mask finally cracked. Jin Ho's composure didn't just break. It dissolved. He looked past Talia to Kong Min, his breathing becoming shallow and ragged. The power was shifting, Min. Jin Ho hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of resentment and desperation. Your mother's influence. It's an anchor. We could have expanded. We could have owned the city if she wasn't so focused on tradition and restraint. I did it for the future of the organization. You did it for a future that didn't include us, Kong Min said, stepping out of the shadows. His hand came down on Talia's shoulder, a heavy possessive weight that signaled her safety and Jin Ho's end. Loyalty that changes when power shifts isn't loyalty at all. It's just an investment that's gone bad. As the guards moved in to take Jin Ho away, Talia realized the ghost was gone. The traitor had been dragged into the light, but the price of that light was a permanent seat at the side of a king. The sleek black sedan cut through the Chicago fog like a blade through silk. Outside, the familiar neon glow of the city had faded into the gray, skeletal silhouettes of the industrial district. Beside her, Kong Min was a silent, brooding force. He hadn't spoken since they left the estate, but the tension radiating from him was a physical thing, thick and suffocating. He was no longer the man who watched from the shadows of a restaurant. He was a general moving toward a battlefield. The warehouse is neutral ground, Kong Min said, his voice cutting through the hum of the engine. He didn't look at her, but he reached out, his gloved hand resting briefly near hers on the leather seat. But neutrality is a thin veil for those who have already committed treason. Jin Ho's backers will be there, waiting to see if their poison worked. Talia looked out at the passing warehouses, her reflection in the glass looking like a stranger's. She was wearing a tailored black suit Jiang Su had provided, a far cry from the server's vest she'd worn only nights ago. She felt like an imposter, a chemistry student caught in a high-stakes reaction she couldn't stop. "You're thinking about the exit," Kongmin murmured, finally turning to look at her. His dark eyes were unreadable, but his thumb brushed against the back of her hand, a gesture that was half warning, half reassurance. "There is no exit tonight, Talia. Only the resolution." "I'm thinking about the science," she lied, though her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "If they know Jinho failed, they won't wait for a toast. They'll look for a new catalyst, a more violent one." "That is why you are with me," he said, his grip tightening slightly. "They see a girl. I see the only person in this city who can spot a lie before it's even spoken. Stay close to my shadow. If I give the signal, you don't look back." The car slowed as it approached a massive, corrugated steel structure at the edge of the river. The lion's den wasn't a metaphor. It was a sprawling complex where the city's underground kings met to settle blood debts. As the gates groaned open, Talia realized she was no longer an invisible observer. She was walking into the heart of the storm, as the primary witness to a crime that was meant to remain hidden. The engine cut out, leaving a hollow, expectant silence. Kongmin stepped out and held the door for her, his tattooed hand extended. As Talia took it, she felt the shift in the air, the cold, metallic scent of water and old oil, and the unmistakable electricity of a trap being set. The warehouse interior was a cathedral of rust and shadow, lit by a single massive iron chandelier that hung over a long, heavy timber table. The air tasted of salt and ozone. At the table sat the heads of the city's foremost powerful syndicates, their faces etched in lines of cold, practiced indifference. Kongmin pulled out a chair for Talia at his right hand. The gesture sent a ripple of low murmurs through the room. To these men, she was an anomaly, a black woman in a world of old-world traditions, a waitress sitting at the table of kings. "You bring a servant to a council of war, Kongmin?" A man at the far end sneered, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. This was Director Park, Jinho's secret benefactor, and the architect of the power grab. "I bring the woman who kept my mother alive," Kongmin replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He signaled to a waiter, one of the warehouse staff, who began pouring a deep red vintage into crystal glasses. "And since we are here to celebrate our continued unity, I thought it only fitting she witnessed the toast." The glasses were filled. The wine sat like pools of blood under the flickering lights. Talia's heart was a drum in her ears, but her eyes were locked on the liquid. She wasn't looking for the scent of almonds this time. She was looking for the surface tension. As Park raised his glass, Talia noticed the slight, unnatural viscosity of the wine in his hand, the way it clung to the glass in legs that were too thick, too slow. It was a subtle chemical surfactant, a carrier for a contact neurotoxin. "To the future," Park declared, his eyes fixed on Kongmin. "Wait!" Talia's voice cut through the room, sharp and clinical. She didn't shout. She spoke with the authority of a professor correcting a fatal error. "Director Park, your wine seems to have oxidized. Or perhaps it's just the dimethyl sulfoxide you added to ensure the poison absorbs through the skin of the throat." The room froze. Park's hand jerked, a single drop of the wine splashing onto his own thumb. He stared at it as if it were a scorpion. "Dimethyl sulfoxide," Talia continued, standing slowly, her chemistry knowledge her only armor. "It's a powerful solvent. It pulls whatever is dissolved in it directly through the skin into the bloodstream. You didn't need us to drink it. You just needed the vapor and a single spill." Kongmin didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, he was on his feet, his 9mm leveled at Park's forehead. The other leaders scrambled back, their chairs screeching against the concrete. "You used my mother's tea as a distraction," Kongmin hissed, his eyes burning with a lethal light. "You wanted us to look for the poison in the food, while you prepared a different reaction for the room." Park's face went ash-gray as the drop of wine began to redden his skin, the neurotoxin already beginning its work. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of Park's glass shattering on the floor. A final echoing crash that signaled the end of his reign. The university library was a world away from the cold concrete of the warehouse and the oppressive luxury of salve. Here the only scent was the comforting dusty aroma of old paper, and the sharp tang of espresso. Talia sat at her usual corner table, her chemistry textbooks spread out before her like a map of a more predictable universe. But as she leaned over her notes, the heavy weight of a solid gold pendant beneath her shirt reminded her that the invisible waitress was a version of herself that no longer existed. A soft shadow fell across her periodic table. Talia didn't startle. She had learned to recognize the specific, silent gravity of his movement. Kong Min stood beside her, looking profoundly out of place in his charcoal wool overcoat against the backdrop of stressed students and plastic chairs. He didn't say anything at first. He simply placed a fresh cup of coffee on the table, tested, she knew, by his own detail before it ever reached her hand. "You're late for your lecture," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to pull the air from the room. "I was finishing a lab report," Talia replied, looking up at him. She no longer felt like a piece of the decor. When he looked at her now, there was no cold indifference, only a sharp, burning focus that made her feel more seen than she ever thought possible. The covalent bonds of organic compounds don't wait for Mafia schedules. A rare, genuine smile tugged at the corner of Kong Min's mouth. He pulled out the chair opposite her, his tattooed hands resting casually on the table. Outside the library windows, a black sedan sat idling, and two men in suits stood with their backs to the glass. A permanent, silent barrier between Talia and the dangers of the world she had helped him navigate. "My mother sent her regards," he murmured, sliding a small velvet box across the table. "She says a woman who can see the invisible should never have to look for her own future. Your tuition for the doctoral program has been settled in full." Talia opened the box to find a vintage fountain pen, its nib engraved with a small, delicate jasmine flower. It was a tool for a scholar given by a queen. "I didn't do it for the money, Min," she said softly. "I know," he said, reaching across the table. He didn't take her hand, but he let his fingers rest near hers, a silent offer of a partnership that transcended the vest she used to wear. "You did it because you saw the truth. And in my world, truth is the rarest element of all." Talia looked from the pen to the man who had once ignored her every night. The ghosts were gone. She was no longer a shadow in a restaurant. She was a woman with the power of science in her hands and the protection of a king at her back. As she tucked the pen into her bag and rose for class, she knew the reaction had reached its final stable state. If this story made you feel something, please like the video and subscribe to this channel for more.